Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 1, Nestling, Chapters 14 and 15. So let's begin. The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling, Chapters 14 and 15. The tail end of summer was still hot, so Izuku was thankful that he had managed to snag a place in the shade to sit at lunch. Okeko was with him and they were waiting for Minato and Kazu to come from their class. They weren't in the same class this year, but that was okay, since they were all still at the same school. Okeko called to the others when they emerged from the building and they both hurried over. Izuku. Okeko. Minato greeted them. Kazu nodded at them both as the two sat down. They all unpacked their lunches. And again, Little Dragon has a bento from Kurogiri. Okeko teased. It was so nice to meet him. Kazu said. Thank you for inviting me to your birthday. She added. Yeah. It was great. Minato said. The air conditioning was divine. Okeko sighed as if it had been the most luxurious thing she'd experienced. The others nodded. Izuku grinned. We'll turn it up next year. He joked. That got a giggle. Little Dragon, does Gigantomachia really work for your dad? Okeko asked. Yes, he's my dad's bodyguard, Izuku said. As they were only 6, none of them really knew what the word bodyguard meant and what it entailed. He's huge. I think it has something to do with his quirk. What is his quirk? Kazu asked. Izuku shook his head. I don't know, he replied because he realized he didn't. He'd never actually written notes on Gigantomachia before, so he didn't know what the man's quirk was. It's gotta be something rock-related, Minato said as he ate his sandwich. Izuku nodded, but there were so many rock-related quirks. Which type did Gigantomachia have? And Kurogiri, Kazu said. I don't think I've ever seen someone with a quirk like that. He can create warp gates, Izuku said. Warp what? Okeko was confused. Warp gates, he confirmed. Sometimes, instead of taking the train, or the car, we get Kurogiri to take us places, Izuku added. What? Minato shared Okako's confusion. It's Kurogiri's quirk, Izuku said. Little Dragon, Kurogiri has a transport quirk? Okeko asked, eyes wide. Izuku nodded. Do you have any idea how rare that is? He nodded again. Transport quirks were about as rare as healing quirks, and anyone with one could do almost anything they wanted. Dad says it's necessary, Izuku shrugged. You said Kurogiri takes care of Tomura? Kazu asked. He does. That's what he does most days. Kazu looked to Okeko, and then to Minato, and then the three of them shrugged. What? Izuku demanded. Minato and Kazu looked to Okeko and the other girls sighed, realizing she'd been nominated to be the one to tell Izuku. Tomura wasn't very nice, she said softly. Oh. Izuku took a few breaths, taking the time to eat one of the grapes Kurogiri had decorated his bento with. Tomura is like that, he said diplomatically. He probably wanted to be with his friends, Minato said. Izuku thought it best not to point out that Tomura didn't have any friends. At least none that he knew about. Well, I can't wait until next year. But you'll all have to come to my party first, Okeko said brightly. Kazu looked away. I don't think I'll be able to, she said softly, looking at her near-empty bento. What do you mean? Minato asked as Izuku slipped a cherry tomato into Kazu's lunchbox. She gulped. Dad says I can't talk to you anymore, she whispered, and Izuku could see tears forming in her eyes. What? Why? Okeko demanded. Kazu burst into tears. I don't know. She wailed. He said that you're a bad influence. She added, still crying. The three of them looked at each other. Izuku shook his head, as did Minato. Was it something one of us did? Izuku asked. Can we apologize? He won't change his mind, she sobbed. I can't talk to you anymore. How will he know? Minato asked. He might only be 6, but he was already showing the instincts that his mother had as a lawyer. He'll know. I'm sorry, I can't, she bawled. That's not fair. Okeko growled. I know. Kazu agreed. But he'll know and I can't. Izuku moved over to give Kazu a hug, but she flinched back from him. He just stared at her, green eyes wide, as she continued to cry. They all stared at Kazu, not knowing what to do until the bell to end lunch rang. Kazu jerked and quickly packed up the remains of her lunch. The others did the same. We'll think of something, Okeko declared as they hurried back into the building. But none of them could. Did something happen? My little dragon? Hisashi asked his son, when Kurogiri dropped him off that night. Izuku seemed down. Kazu said she can't talk to us anymore, his son said. It took Hisashi a moment to remember who she was. It answered one question for him. One of the parents had decided to be stupid. Oh, Izuku, Hisashi breathed, holding out his arms. His son took the opportunity and rushed up to him, throwing his smaller arms around his chest as All for One held his son close. I don't know why, Izuku said, tears falling. Hisashi rocked Izuku back and forth, crooning slightly. It was not a sight anyone who knew Hisashi in a professional aspect, above or below ground, would expect. I don't know what I did wrong. Izuku continued. You did nothing wrong, Hisashi was quick to reassure his son. Then why can't Kazu talk to us? Izuku made the almost instantaneous demand for knowledge. He was silent for a few moments, just comforting Izuku, before he sighed. Do you remember last year? My little dragon, on your first day of school when you asked about the quirkless children? He wasn't expecting his son to nod after a moment of thought. It wouldn't matter if Izuku didn't. Hisashi had reinforced that lesson several times through the year, and now, with the new school year, he had a new opportunity. People are cruel, my little dragon. People are prejudiced and stupid and bitter. But Kazu's not. So why can't she talk to us? It's not Kazu, Hisashi said. Who told her that she can't talk to you? He probed. Already knowing the answer. Her dad, Izuku answered immediately. He's afraid, my little dragon. He's afraid, and that is making him cruel. What is he afraid of? You. That broke through Izuku's tears. His son jerked back to stare at him. What? Green eyes were incredulous. He's afraid of you, Hisashi repeated, his eyes serious. He could tell Izuku didn't know how to respond to that. A 6-year-old was not someone to be afraid of. When you asked questions last year about the quirkless kids, you weren't doing it because you were a sympathizer, Hisashi began to explain. You were doing it because you wanted to know. Because you were seeking knowledge, yes? Izuku nodded, but there was still a confused air about him. That's why he's afraid. Because I asked about the quirkless kids? Hisashi gave Izuku a soft smile. Not just that, he told his son. Because you seek the truth out. Because you aren't afraid of the truth. Kazu's dad is afraid of the truth. But why? Izuku's voice was plaintive. Because Kazu's dad is like most people, weak and unable to think for themselves, Hisashi said. When people are afraid they are cruel, and if they are afraid of the truth, then they are prejudiced, he explained. Izuku's face became thoughtful. All for One watched and waited for his son to work through some of his words. He knew Izuku wouldn't understand this, not completely, but he would remember the tone. He would remember the meaning. So for Kazu to talk to us again, her dad has to not be afraid? He asked the oddly worded question. Hisashi nodded. From a child's point of view, that is what had to happen. Or Kazu just had to defy her father, which is not something he thought would happen. Izuku thought for a little longer, and then he nodded, green curls bouncing with the movement. His face took on a serious visage, or as serious as his soft, freckled features could be. Then I'll become a hero. So that Kazu's dad doesn't have to be afraid. That's goo. Wait, what? All for One ran the last line through his mind again. It didn't change. Izuku had just said he'd become a hero. He thought Izuku had begun to grow out of that phase, and now it appeared he'd plunged headlong back into it. How will that help? Hisashi asked instead, not going back to his previous sentence. Kazu's dad is afraid, Izuku explained. Heroes make it so that people aren't afraid. So if I'm a hero, Kazu's dad won't need to be afraid and she can talk to us again. I think that might be a little slow, Hisashi told his son. You have to grow up before you can be a hero. He added, cringing a little at the quasi-validation that sentence gave his son. Izuku frowned. You'll have to wait years before you can speak to Kazu if you have to become a hero first, he continued. Timelines weren't, after all, a 6-year-old's strength. Oh, Izuku said slowly, nodding, and Hisashi knew his mind was still working at the problem. It was one of the things that was good about Izuku, even when a solution was not obvious, and sometimes when there was no solution, he continued to think about the problem. Continued to come up with ways of solving it. This was one problem he wouldn't be able to solve though, and it would be a difficult lesson. Besides, All for One continued before Izuku could fully process his words. There are heroes already, he pointed out. And Kazu's dad is still afraid. That information screwed up little Izuku's face again as he tried to reconcile that with what he thought. Eventually Izuku frowned. "Why is that, Daddy?" he asked. Hisashi let Izuku feel the deep breath he took and he made sure his face displayed his regret. "Because heroes are people, my little dragon, and people are cruel." "Not heroes," his son objected. "Even heroes," Hisashi corrected. He could tell that Izuku didn't like that conclusion, but his son wasn't someone who ran from the truth. "Even All Might?" Izuku asked in a whisper. Hisashi bit the inside of his lip to avoid saying, "especially All Might." Instead he nodded slowly, affecting an air of sadness. "Even All Might," he told Izuku in a return whisper. He could see the way Izuku's lip trembled. As if he was about to cry, but his son held back the tears and Hisashi was pleased that he did not get any argument. He let his words stand for several minutes in which Izuku was silent before he took another deep breath. "Let's go practice your quirks, my little dragon," All for One made the offer to his son. Izuku immediately perked up and wriggled to drop down from his lap. "Let's go." "Well, my little dragon, if pushing the air towards your fire breath extinguishes the flame, what do you think pulling it away will do?" All for One asked his son, who was looking a little dejected at how the latest test to combine fire breath and Kali Imperium was going. He wasn't surprised. He hadn't yet told Izuku that his quirk wasn't actually air control but nitrogen control. Pushing that much nitrogen towards fire breath would naturally extinguish it. At least Izuku had learned that he could put out fires with Kali Imperium though. Now it was time to show him that he could do the opposite. Izuku frowned. Hisashi could see that his son didn't think it would make a difference. "Just give it a try," he encouraged, and his unspoken words were that you must always experiment. Maybe Izuku should spend some more time with the doctor? He wasn't afraid to experiment. All for One watched as Izuku took a deep breath, the freckles on his face shifting as he concentrated. For his own part, Hisashi had already layered Izuku with some protection quirks and he was thinking about getting Izuku a quirk that made him fireproof. While fire breath was not necessarily the strongest quirk, as Izuku's first quirk, apart from his own, it would be one he relied upon. He should be immune to its effects. Izuku blew out, creating a small flame, and Hisashi saw the exact moment. Izuku pulled the air away from it. There was a spark and then the flame grew, forming a ball that was rolled upwards in the air away from his son. It was only a moment, because the fire startled Izuku and broke his concentration, but it was enough. "Did you see that?" Izuku asked excitedly. Hisashi grinned and nodded. "I did, my little dragon," he praised. "Why don't you try it again? But this time, pull the air away from your breath at a bit more of a distance?" Izuku looked confused for a moment before he understood. Then his concentration face came back and Hisashi watched as Izuku pushed out a small tongue of flame again. This was more directed, going out from his son. Izuku shook his head. "Not that one," he muttered and took another breath to try again. Another tongue of flame came out of his mouth, and this time, Hisashi watched as near the end of it, it changed shape, and then raced along an invisible line only Izuku could see. He clapped his hands. "Perfect. Now you are a little dragon." Hisashi laughed delightedly. Izuku was pleased as well. "Do you think I can make shapes? Or a rope? Or a huge fireball?" he asked. "I'm sure you will be able to do all of them," All for One replied. "Let's practice with just Kali Imperium now," he added. For a moment Izuku looked disappointed, but from experience, Izuku knew he quickly got exhausted if he used both quirks together too much, and so he nodded. "You can think of more things to try for next time," Hisashi consoled him. "For now, I want to see how much you can lift." That brightened Izuku up immediately, and Izuku rushed over to the weight. They were small, but then Izuku was small as well. Hisashi had explained to his son that practicing with a quirk would make it stronger, so while Izuku could only lift a modest 10 kilos now, in time, with practice, he'd be able to lift much more, and maybe himself. His friend Okeko had served as a great example there. Izuku knew she could only lift about 80 kilos now, and that was up from the 20 she used to be able to manage. He was taking it as a challenge to try to catch up as fast as he could. "Let's start with the small one," Hisashi instructed, and watched as Izuku focused on the 1 kilo weight. After a few moments, it rose into the air. He grinned and clapped before gesturing to the next weight. Izuku would work his way up on the weights, and then, all for one knew, what could be lifted, could also be dropped, or squashed, or cut or, the list was almost endless of what you could do, even if you couldn't modify the chemical composition of nitrogen. Kali Imperium might not have been the quirk he thought it was, but in his son's hands, it was going to serve him well. Wah? Izuku was shaken from a sound sleep. Little lord. He recognized Gigantamachia's voice. You must come with me, the huge man said. Izuku blinked. Fear instantly overwhelmed him and he felt tears form in his eyes. He could hear shouting outside his bedroom but couldn't see anything because Gigantomachia was blocking the doorway. You must come, little lord. He wanted his dad. But Gigantomachia's voice provided him something to focus on and he knew that the man would take him to his father. Izuku nodded, and pushed the covers down. He shivered slightly. The air was cold but he didn't let that stop him. Get your notebooks, Gigantomachia added when Izuku came towards him. For a moment Izuku didn't know what the large man meant and then he nodded and went to the bookshelf that was in his room. His notebooks were lined up on the bottom shelf. There were 4 at the moment. One about his classmates. One on himself, and then 2 others filled with notes on the quirks he'd seen from heroes and others. He pushed back at his fear and grabbed them, putting them into his school backpack. Gigantomachia had turned slightly while he was doing that. And Izuku heard a scream that was abruptly cut off. Bad. Gigantomachia roared but Izuku knew that it was not to him. He moved behind the huge man and touched him gently. That brought his dad's bodyguard's attention and Gigantomachia turned back quickly. I won't let them hurt you, little lord, he proclaimed. What about daddy? Izuku asked as Gigantomachia picked up him, bag and all. He was quickly settled into the crook of the huge man's arm and then they were off, moving down the corridor. Izuku was facing Gigantomachia's chest. He couldn't see what was happening but he could see that the lights were flashing and heard yells and shouts. Some were close, others were distant. My lord sent me to get you. Gigantomachia seemed proud of that fact and Izuku reached up to hold the radio that was around the large man's neck. Stop, villain. Izuku didn't recognize the voice and all he could think about was to cry that Gigantomachia wasn't a villain. He was his friend. Before he could say anything, he felt Gigantomachia's grip on him tighten. It wasn't uncomfortable but Izuku couldn't see anything and couldn't squirm at all. Then he felt the large man charge forward. He heard a startled cry and felt Gigantomachia's other arm move. Something crashed, and then there came more crashes. It sounded like Gigantomachia was crashing through walls but nothing slowed him down and nothing hit Izuku. The air got a bit dusty but he didn't complain. Get out of my way. Gigantomachia demanded. Izuku didn't know who he was talking to. You won't get away, villain. Came the response. Who was that? It was someone different this time but Gigantomachia wasn't a villain. Why did they keep calling him that? He felt the large man tense again and then they were moving. Stop him. Someone screamed but Izuku then felt the familiar weightlessness that came with moving through Kurogiri and a moment later the noise vanished. Little lord? Gigantomachia called to him and Izuku felt his arm pull back. He sat up, still supported by the large man's bulk and looked around. He didn't recognize where he was, but he could see Kurogiri and Tomura were there, so it must be okay. Gigantomachia carefully lifted him down and then Izuku got the impression that he was being examined. I'm fine, he said, swallowing down his fear before he shivered. It was cold here. Are you cold? Kurogiri asked, his voice concerned. Izuku nodded which prompted the misty man to look around. Izuku did as well but he couldn't see much. There were crates and crates of things stacked up around him but he didn't know where he was, or what was in them. Kurogiri apparently saw something, as he went to one of the crates which was resting on the ground. He pushed open the lid and bent in to rummage in the box. When he stood upright, Izuku saw that he had several pieces of fabric in his hand. The yellow-eyed man came back and gently draped one of the pieces of fabric over Izuku. It was a blanket and he snagged it eagerly, wrapping it around himself. Kurogiri gave one to Tomura as well and it seemed odd but he offered one to Gigantomachia as well but the large man didn't take it. You should try to get some more sleep, Izuku, Kurogiri gave the instruction. Izuku shook his head. He couldn't sleep. What happened? He asked. The heroes found us, you moron, Tomura answered before Kurogiri and Gigantomachia could say anything. Izuku frowned. Why would the heroes do something like that? They were meant to help people. And if that was heroes, why had they called Gigantomachia a villain? It wasn't heroes, he said. Heroes didn't do that. TCH. It was, yo. That's enough, Tomura. Izuku recognized his dad's voice and he looked around to see his dad appear from behind one of the stacks of crates. His dad looked at him, and again Izuku got the impression he was being examined. I'm all right, he said, a bit crossly. He didn't know what had happened but he was fine. That caused his dad to smile. I'm glad to hear it, my little dragon. He said, though, as Kurogiri said, you should get some more sleep. You have school. But what happened, Daddy? Izuku insisted on asking. His dad sighed and came up to him, kneeling down so that he could look Izuku in the eye. I didn't want to worry you, my little dragon, but sometimes my work causes people to come after me, he explained. Come after you? Izuku asked with a frown. They want to arrest me, his dad said. But only bad people get arrested. Izuku objected. He ignored the way Tomura rolled his eyes. He could see that motion from between the fingers of the hand covering Tomura's face. Izuku saw his dad take a deep breath. Not always, Izuku. Remember what I said about cruelty, and how people can fear the truth? Izuku nodded. Kazu still wasn't allowed to talk to them. Those who fear the truth, try to suppress it. What does suppress mean? It means to silence them, his dad explained. If they arrest me, then they can silence me, and the truth that I know won't frighten them anymore. But the truth is the truth, Izuku objected. It is. And that's why we have to move past this. Bad people want to silence me but I won't let them. And I won't let them get you either. That's why Gigantomachia protected you. Izuku didn't really understand, but now that the fear was fading, and the blanket was warm around him, he was feeling sleepy again. But if his dad said that the people were bad, then they were the villains, even though they'd accused Gigantomachia of being one. Besides, everything would be okay because his dad was here, so it couldn't all be bad. He nodded at his dad but felt his eyes trembling. Now, my little dragon, you need to sleep, his dad instructed, and Izuku didn't even get the chance to say good night again before his eyes closed and he felt warm arms around him. Gigantomachia, take Izuku, All for One ordered coldly, ignoring the chaos that was swirling around him. Make sure he has his notebooks, he added the order. He knew his son had written about him and about his quirk. While the heroes might take it as simply childish ramblings, there was no need to risk it. They weren't in that much danger that they couldn't take the time to get the books. The large man moved off and All for One issued a few more orders to his underlings. He would have thought they were used to this and know what to do, but he always had to give instructions. Hero raids were so boring. You won't get away, ruthless Jade, came the cry from one of the heroes. Internally, All for One was shocked. That was who they were after. That was one of his minor aliases and he didn't think he'd done anything that bad in that guise. He'd have to re-examine his dealings if this was the result. But if that's who the heroes were after, that was a good thing. Ruthless Jade had nothing to do with his civilian persona. One of the heroes rushed into the room Hisashi was directing from. All for One recognized Scarlet Scorpion, who had a mutation-type quirk even as he shrugged. And flicked one arm as if swatting a fly. Scarlet Scorpion was thrown back into the wall and Hisashi heard the crunch of broken chitin and saw the splatter of blood. It was a very different Scarlet than the hero's usual shade. Rushing ahead was the last mistake the hero ever made, though it confirmed for him that buffoon, All Might, wasn't here. If he was, then no doubt, the current holder of One for All would have come after him. No, the heroes didn't know who they had found. That made him somewhat angry and All for One moved out of the room and strode down the corridor. In the distance he heard a rumble he recognized as Gigantomachia. This particular hero raid had no doubt scared his son, and that was unforgivable. Another hero, Freeze Star, charged at him and met the same fate as Scorpion. Really, you'd think they'd have a bit more caution around someone they didn't know. But the second hero told Hisashi that it was time to retreat and he closed his eyes, summoning a range of quirks to him, before he activated them. To anyone watching, it would appear as if he'd disappeared. To someone who could perceive super-fast events, they would have seen Hisashi take off down the corridor, out the door and past the cordon of heroes. He only stopped when he reached the rooftop of one of the surrounding buildings. He stopped and turned around, watching the raid from a safe distance. There were flashing lights from the police vehicles and several more heroes roaming around the outside. He recognized several agencies but confirmed that no one from All Might's agency was there. That was something, though no doubt the deaths of the heroes would get back to All Might. Ruthless Shade might have gotten away tonight, but it appeared that Alias was dead, and more importantly, Hisashi Rigi was still in play. I want to sleep longer, Izuku moaned as something pushed at him. The blankets were warm and he was lying on something soft. You need to wake up, Izuku. It's sleeping time, he muttered and tried to grab at the blankets. He was so tired. You have to get to school, Kurogiri told him. Izuku groaned and sat up, and it was only then that he realized the air was cold and he wasn't in his room. He was still in that place with crates. And he was lying on Gigantomachia. Wha? He asked. Kurogiri held out his uniform. You need to get ready for school, he said before Izuku saw the man's eyes narrow. Bathroom first, he decided. Izuku nodded and dragged his blanket around him as he followed. The building was huge, and was filled with crates, but there were pathways between them. Izuku, your dad is already taking care of things. We'll be moving to a new place tonight, Kurogiri told him as they made their way through the crates. And you can't tell anyone what happened last night. Why not? Izuku asked. Because if you do, then the bad people might find your dad again, Kurogiri told him. Izuku bit his lip and he felt tears gathering in his eyes. He didn't want that. It was scary. I won't tell anyone, he promised. He did not want his dad caught. He wouldn't let those who feared his dad do bad things. He felt, more than saw Kurogiri's smile at his confirmation. Very good, Izuku. You were very brave last night, the Misty Man told him. The bathroom is through there, he added, changing the subject back to safer topics. Be quick because you are running late. Izuku nodded and went to the bathroom before coming out. Kurogiri helped him change and then the man made a warp gate and they were gone from the building. Whoa! You don't have a bento today, Minato said as he came into the classroom. Izuku was still rearranging the desks so that he could sit with Minato and Okeko for lunch. Usually they'd go outside, but it was currently bucketing down, and Izuku thought there was hail mixed in with the rain. Kurogiri was really busy last night, he told his friend. They were all really busy last night. He must have been really busy. Okeko joked. Izuku shrugged and sat back at his desk as Minato joined them. They'd shifted 2 desks together so that the 3 of them could sit facing each other. But he was tired. What happened last night had left him sleepy and he wanted nothing more than to sleep. But he had to eat lunch first. Are you okay? Minato asked. Okeko already had. Just tired, Izuku said with a yawn. He'd woken up this morning to find that he'd been sleeping on Gigantomachia. The huge man hadn't minded, and Kurogiri had somehow gotten him a uniform. The Misty Man had shown him to the bathroom facilities and then helped him dress. After that, Kurogiri had formed a portal and they'd gone to a convenience store. Kurogiri had bought him a lunch bento as well as several different onigiri for breakfast. Those had been packed into Izuku's bag, while the other bentos the Misty Man had bought had been packed into plastic. Izuku knew they were for his dad, Tomura, Gigantomachia and Kurogiri himself. Then, since he'd been running late, Kurogiri had taken him to the lane behind the store, while telling him where to go for a pickup after school before he'd formed a warp gate and deposited Izuku just inside his school building. Izuku had rushed to his classroom with minutes to spare and had only just managed to gobble down an onigiri before his homeroom teacher entered. Did you not sleep well? Minato asked with concern. Izuku shook his head as he opened the store-bought bento. There was a portion of rice, some pickles, something that looked like it could have been potato salad with some seaweed half over it and a tonkatsu. Izuku smiled. At least Kurogiri had tried to treat him that way. He dug into it. He was tired. But even as young as he was, Izuku knew it would be worse to be tired and hungry. Everything is all right, isn't it, Izuku? Okeko asked carefully, looking at her friend. I'm just tired, Izuku replied. He wanted to say more. He wanted to tell them about the bad people, but if they would attack his dad, then Izuku had no doubt they'd attack others. It was safer if they just didn't know. Izuku smiled. He'd protect them, because that was what a hero did. End chapters 14 and 15. The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling. Author note: don't worry, there is only so long AFO will allow this hero phase of Izuku's to continue. He's still hoping Izuku will grow out of it. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.